welcome you to the November meeting of the Education and Learning Committee. Before we get into the body of the agenda, can I just mention that this young gentleman on my right-hand side, this is his last committee meeting. Colin's been with the council for 12 and a half years, or as he expressed it to me yesterday, an eighth of a century. So I think that gives some indication of the great events which have happened in the 12 and a half years, and it has been a very interesting period in all sorts of aspects. So this is Colin's last meeting, and I think the week after next, he takes over a role with Addis, and we, on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you for all your service to the committee and to the council over that period, and to wish you the very best of success in your new role. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you. Thanks. Chair, I'll maybe get a chance just to say something at the end, if that's okay, but I would invite members not to make it a difficult committee this morning then.
I'll second that. So, SEDERUNT and apologies, Tracy.
Thank you, Chair. We've got 24 members present. I've no apologies, and at the start of the meeting, not present is Councillor Sloan, and not present is Timothy Burrell and Sam Scobie.
And do you have any declarations of interest? Willie?
Just to say that Tom is swimming his way here, Chair. So he will be late.
Right. Take it he's coming up the A75 rather than the Solway, is he? Okay. You may have noticed there aren't actually any minutes appended. That was because it was agreed at full council, but I've asked for hard copies of the minutes to be handed out, and they should be in front of you. Colin, I think you want to say something with regard to the minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Just to mention that in around item 11, normally early years expansion is a standing item, but during the last period, in the holiday period, there wasn't an awful lot of activity, but it's simply to say that there's been continued to be good progress, and a report will come to the January committee for consideration.
Thanks, Colin. Okay, so if we move on to item 3 on page 11, supporting learners, refocusing of the service, update 2, report by the Director of Education and Learning. The committee last received an update on progress with the service in July. The report today details the restructure of the supporting learners service as part of the refocusing exercise and highlights the recently announced national review of additional support for learning provision. The report sets out plans to review ASL pathways across the region and enrolment procedures for resource provision. Details of the new arrangements in schools for the Health Board speech and language therapy service work is included, along with an update on ongoing work with schools on getting it right for every child and safeguarding. And we have Hugh Smith to speak to this. Is there anything you want to add, Hugh?
Thank you, Chair. Nothing to add, but obviously available to take any questions.
Members? Dick?
He'll have to lose a few stones, I think. All right, not to you, fade away. No, he's a big lad, so yeah. And he's bigger than me, so I won't say any more. All right, sorry, Chair. And sorry, Ivor. So, okay, I don't know if this report contains enough information that meaningful to know exactly what's going on in support for learning across there. We've got lots of information about all the chiefs in the centre, but not really much information about what's going on in the schools, how many learning support teachers there are in the schools across the region, how many children are in our learning centres. And I think more and more, the more and more responsibility is put on our classroom teachers to do things which they didn't do 20 years ago. Remember when they introduced inclusion into schools, where more people with complex additional needs were brought into secondary and primary schools. that was brought on the premise that there would be special support in schools to support the class teachers and to support children with complex difficulties. And I think that we've now got a very spare support for children with special needs, etc., in our schools, because primary schools there's virtually no support for extra support for the children, and secondary schools it has been paid right back. And we're talking about support for learning teachers who've got the expertise. They've done an extra 2 years qualification to understand the needs of children, how to break down the barriers of learning. They have maybe got specialist qualifications in dyslexia study, which classroom teachers don't have. And classroom teachers do a great job, but they have not had the 2 years extra training. And they're expected to have the same skills with a few inset days here and there. So I think that is my point here. We've got expertise in the centre. We've got people with knowledge and expertise in the centre, managing things, and no troops, no Indians in the ground fighting the war against dyslexia and literacy and numeracy needs. So that's my point there. So the question is, could we have more information on what's actually going on the ground, so to support, which will be helpful in upcoming budget decisions. And I'll refer you to one question in particular. Page 12 is halfway down, and it says mapping of supporting learners pathways. So it says 3.4, the 16 learning centres and the staffing will be not transferred over to schools while these pathways and gaps are addressed. So does that mean that when the skills are addressed, then they will be transferred? And what does that mean? Because that could have enormous consequences and knock-ons. So the question is, could we have more information about what's actually going on and about that special point there on 3.4?
Okay. Director?
Thanks, Chair. Maybe if I could start off, and who might want to add something to that. Clearly this paper wasn't designed to be bringing information on numbers. We've done that at different times, but we can provide that information again for you. I do have to say I don't recognise the description that Councillor Brodie's painted in terms of ASL and no support. We've got 22 primary peripatetic teachers. We've got around 500 support staff in schools, and we have the same number of support hours that we've had for the last 3 years are applied for this year. So I don't recognise that there's no support out there. That's not to say that there isn't an ongoing challenge, and there's no doubt about it. The demand is sometimes increasing, and our teachers are having to upskill all of the time. The reason the report's a little bit about chiefs instead of Indians is precisely that we've left all of the support out there in the schools at the same number, same level, and what we've tried to do is, in supporting the council's very difficult fiscal challenge, take any savings from the centre, and that's why the report relates to that. Certainly, I'm happy if Hugh wants to add anything to that, and we can provide further information with numbers for you in terms of a briefing, if you would like that.
Thank you, Director. I wouldn't really have anything to add in terms of the general position. Absolutely, this paper was about updating members on the progress in terms of reducing the central team, which was a member decision in terms of trying to retain and support the frontline provision that the service delivers. And as Colin's indicated, the numbers haven't significantly changed over the last 3 years. With regard to the future planning for our learning centres, I think that will obviously, at this point in time, we're saying we're retaining that responsibility jointly with schools. We will need to work further on that, and we'll come back obviously with members with what that plan looks like. But at this stage, there's no plans, as is in the report, to move the responsibility for learning centres over to schools. In terms of the governance arrangements, given that they're generally regional resources as opposed to individual school and catchment resources, I think that that's one of our key issues in terms of the practicality of shifting that responsibility, when as an education authority we have to be able to make sure we've got resource and provision for all children across the region.
Julie?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to bring up a few points. You were asking about the state of support within our schools. Maybe the same support is still there, Hugh, but I would argue that we've had increasing numbers of children from a young age coming in with more difficulties, more needs, more support, and there are not physically the bodies on the ground to cope with them. I appreciate it's a thankless task that financially the authority appears to be in a very difficult position. I would also bring back the point that Colin said about 22 additional support for learning teachers across primary school. It was my understanding that they were about to be halved. Having just read something in the Engage, either last week or the week before, that there was being consultation and that we were looking to reduce the numbers of additional support for learning teachers, and that those teachers would no longer work directly with children, that they would do the planning and work with teaching staff, but wouldn't necessarily be working directly with the children. So it was really just for some clarification on that, having, as I say, read it and Engage. Thank you.
Okay, again, just I suppose at quite a high level, I'm happy to take that question because it relates to the transformation and budget setting programme. There's no intention, there is no intent in what's been set out. The council has sought to set out a range of options that might cover the funding gap. They are options at this stage. There's no decision being taken by council until February on that, and part of the reason that you've seen that publicly is precisely because we're going out and testing out some of those options with the public, and parents and public are certainly making their concerns and making their views known about that particular option, and I'm sure that members will take that into account, even though it's a difficult financial situation that we're in. Okay.
George?
I'll use this one. Yeah, I'll just use this one. Mel's lost her voice anyway, so. This might sound like a broken record, but I make no apologies for that. From a parental perspective, we fully acknowledge the needs of the more obvious concerns with children with assisted support learning, in the learning centres, etc., etc. There's a lot of kids in mainstream schools that have problems with, for example, anxiety, severe anxiety, that have difficulty even getting in the classroom. And the burden on teachers teaching these sort of children is quite challenging. Also, kids with Asperger's and things of that nature that are less obvious. The burden on teachers is quite considerable, I would say, especially the teachers that have got a real empathy with these kids, but identifying and then actually helping these kids go to what we call positive destinations. Often they underachieve. And if the teachers do take the time to help these young folk, it's an extra burden on the teachers, which is hugely welcome. In my position with parental groups, we hear from parents with the stress and strains of these types of children. And it's really heartbreaking sometimes when kids are not enjoying school, they're not able to achieve at school, but they don't have necessarily a badge, a tag. And the teachers that work hard with these young people need more support. And I know the financial constraints, but my proposition is that we acknowledge there's a lot of kids out there with underlying issues that have been addressed to a certain extent, but a lot of these kids are getting missed and they're not achieving what they might achieve. And probably more importantly, school can be really, really difficult for these kids. So I think we need to acknowledge that within this assisted support learning, as well as the more obvious things. And I think it is teacher support, teacher numbers, classroom assistance. It's very complex. But also I would add support for parents, because parents go through a lot of misery because their kids are unhappy.
I think if I could pick up 2 points in a response, and I suppose the first is that, that the capacity that we have is stretched, and we are seeing more and more children coming into our schools with needs, and some of those are quite basic parenting needs in reality. We still wait to see the impact of the increase of learning and childcare. I think that from moving from 475 to 600 hours hasn't necessarily delivered that expectation that we thought that children would be coming more ready to learn. But clearly the shift in the next year to 1140 hours should start to see a premium. So we hope that we will start to see children arriving in P1 better able and more ready to learn, and parents more ready and able to support their children to learn. In terms of those young people, George, that you're talking about, absolutely, and I suppose, you know, one of the key initiatives that we're taking forward as a council is the counselling in schools and being able to bring in more capacity to actually, and counsellors that will be available for young people. We are seeing increasing numbers of young people being effectively signed off by colleagues in health from school because of anxiety. Part of the restructuring as our service and to focus a key resource in terms of attendance was not simply to be the old attendance officer, it was actually to tackle the issues that are underlying poor attendance, which is often anxiety related, anxiety related that we're seeing. So we are trying to, I suppose, target the resources that we've got the best and most efficient way. And the reality is that our school teachers are, you know, it is responsibilities for all. We are expecting everybody to be able to take a part in meeting the needs of all young people. The majority of our young people with additional needs in Dumfries and Galloway are in mainstream classes, and it is about building the confidence and the skills of all of our staff to be able to support them and take a big part in that role. But absolutely, I'm not denying that we are seeing increasing numbers of needs across Scotland, which is partly why it's referenced in the report that Angela Morgan has been asked by the Scottish Government to undertake a review of additional supports. Is it sustainable, given that over the last 10 years we've seen a 20-25% increase in the number of children identified with additional support needs?
Ian?
Thank you, Chair. Just a specific point and a general point, if that's okay, Chair. The specific is in regards to the guidance what we've been asked to agree, not the guidance, sorry, the new enrolment policy. I just wondered, it looks on the face of it like it's not being imposed on us, but essentially it's there, so we should be doing it, so it's just there for that reason. But you thought that there should be some benefits from that as well? If there is, what are there? Is there any cons in regards to that as well? I suppose is try to encapsulate that in one question. A general point that when I was reading this, I feel there's been some very healthy conversations around about the new model education that the Dumfries and Galloway Council could be implementing over the next 3 years through the transformation process. So I just wondered if this was a wee bit preemptive. I know we've got to be proactive, we've got to address the needs of the individuals as we're going ahead and going forward, but is this a little bit preemptive, do you think, or is it, wouldn't like to think that in 3 years' time we've actually got a square peg we're trying to fit in a round hole if we're looking at a new model of education rolling forward. So a general point and a specific, Chairman.
You?
Okay, Councillor, with regards to the enrolment policy, effectively what we've taken is the Code of Practice, which is the legislative driver for us in terms of how we have to respond to requests for placements, and that all our learning centres are effectively special schools. So I don't think, so it's, in a sense, it's really just setting out the legal expectations in terms of that process, and it gives us a means and a robustness in terms of parental challenge or challenged by any other service as well, because sometimes we do get to the point where we may have a different view in terms of the needs and the best response for a young person, and that can very quickly escalate into tribunals and processes like that. So it's really just to be able to set out a formal process that actually allows us to be able to say we've followed that process. So we're not, it's not something that's set out with the Code of Practice, which is effectively the Bible for additional support needs. So I think that's that would hopefully be the response to that. In terms of generally, we are at the moment under pressure. Our learning centres, our resource provision, our inclusion bases are struggling with capacity. And actually the reality is that if you look back in the last 10 years, has there been, in fact probably the last 20 years, a strategy about where they are and the pathways for a young person that's identified in early years to be able to know how they move through their school experience up to leaving. I wouldn't say there's clear paths across every part and locality within Dumfries and Galloway. So this is really effectively for us to be able to bring into that transformation conversation. These are the pathways, what we need. This is what we haven't got. This is the quality of resource that we need. This is the type. We've talked in some of the information that you've received this morning about the need to be looking at autism specifically, big pressure on across our services. So we anticipate this mapping work and the work that we're doing will come into the transformational conversation, and we'll look at what schools look like to be able to meet a large proportion of our school population who have additional support needs, and that smaller group but have very complex needs who will need very specialist provision.
Okay, I'll just go through the list of speakers. I've got Willie Scobie, John Young, Jim McComb, Robert McChristen, Jim Dempster and Kenny Pullen. So Willie?
some list. Chair, I want to associate myself and echo some of the remarks that have been already made today, in as much as I don't think there is enough information in this, even though it's perhaps a different paper, but we do need this information in terms of how we're providing, not just in terms of what the structure is going to be, but what the impact is going to have on the kids who do require additional support for learning. And I think the figure that was quoted was some just below 4,000 kids across the school estate that require some form of additional support needs. And if I take what Colin said in terms of that there are 500 employed in the department, then if the figure is something near 4,000, that works out to 1 to 8 for every one of that additional support for learners. And that's just taken a proportion. And we all know that some of these kids require 2 to 1, 1 to 1, and it depends where they're placed on the metrics. So we do need a report that clearly lays out how we're addressing these however many, and I think the figure is just below 4,000 that require some additional need to help them, achieve it and reach their maximum potential. I know that some will require less support than others, but we need to know how these are being met and whether there is sufficient number of resources. In my opinion, there is just not enough, and it was made worse when we took out nearly £750,000 out of last year's budget, and again on what's coming forward, then there's a possibility that or it's being suggested we take a further 300,000 from additional support. I don't think we can sustain that in any way, or even attempt to take £300,000 out of additional support needs. I'll look at 3.2, and in one of the sentences, what continues to engage with staff, users and stakeholders on establishing systems, and it's systems to disaggregate assisted support for learners. Everyone in the Education Committee got a letter from a parent who was advising, counselling against taking out any kind of funding or moving towards specialist schools. And Adam and I met with that particular parent, and she was making points, good points, and none more so than we could be breaching the Children's Act in terms of a child's education and the right to an inclusive system within education, if that's their choice. And there's also the Article 24, or the human rights in the right for a disabled person to be educated. So I think as we keep reducing, then we do run the risk of being challenged in the court of session, in that we are not providing the service to these 4,000 kids, however much they may require. And that's why we need the information in terms of putting it into categories. Without, in 4,000, I'm sure you wouldn't identify the kids, but we do need that information that goes along with structures, not just to leave it as a structural report, but to say how we're meeting the needs of these kids. Some will be general and might cope within a classroom setting. Others are requiring more support needs. But in my opinion, we're grossly under-resourced, going back to when we used to have classroom assistants, then we moved them up to support for learners, but we've reduced from those days. And I think that we do need a report, and that report has to focus on how we're delivering and what the impact is on these kids in terms of the ones who need it. So I would support the idea that we have a proper and a full report with the fullest information in the report.
Houston.
We can obviously work on that and bring that back to the next committee. I would say I think that because we've regularly reported to committee, and I feel that we have included information, but I understand Councillor Scobie's point of bringing that all together into one kind of position paper. I think the point that you make as well is that of that large number of children, a large majority of those are actually, we would say, currently at our universal level. So they are actually receiving support in the classroom. And I know that, and I've said this at committee before, that that the international research, the most respected research about using learning assistants, assistant teachers, is that actually that it's access to teaching that is the key impact for young people with additional supports. It's not creating the barrier sometimes that we do with the additional member of staff who is there to support, or in fact sometimes can get in between the teacher and the pupil. So it's all about individual circumstances, about individual planning. That's what's happening on a daily basis across all of our schools, and then it's about using the resources most effectively. But we can certainly come back with a paper that will give more information and pull some of that information we previously reported and further evidence in terms of capturing the impact. I suppose one of the key measures for us is ultimately, in terms of positive destinations, though we have large numbers of young people that identify with additional support needs, we still have a very high rate in terms of young people that are moving into a positive destination.
Yeah, and as you say, Willie, we all got the email from that lady, I can't remember her name, I'm hopeless at names, and I think her principal concern was that we were moving away from mainstream support for youngsters, and as it says on page 31 in the report, the main principle on which support and learners provision is based in Dumfries and Galloway is that support is provided within mainstream schools. I think it's important we emphasise that. Okay, John?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I found the pathways very interesting and informative. A couple of points. On page 17, there's a well laid out structure diagram, but it doesn't seem to have a role for the child or the child's parent within that diagram, and I wondered where they fitted in. And on another point, looking at the trends in the number of diagnoses of autism, and it's quite frightening the way it's increasing. Has there ever been any investigation whether, I know it's always best if children are taught in their own school, but has there ever been any research done on whether this region could build a purpose-built autism unit for children? So two things. Thank you.
Yeah, Hugh?
Okay, thank you. The first point is, and apologies, that this is purely a kind of employee structure. So this is the structure that we use effectively for planning the service and managing staff. So it wouldn't have our stakeholders in this, and that would be, I suppose, a different diagram and different map. What I would say is, that all the parts of this service is about engaging. It's all about delivery. It's all about planning for individual children. That would be where children and young people are. In terms of how we arrive at these sorts of structures, that is in part through discussion with key stakeholders. We work with the Parent Council Forum. We work with key interests like Parents Inclusion Network, Square Peg. We are trying to develop, our key stakeholder partner in so much of what we do are parents, because the parents are delivering most of the support to their children, and actually we're a much smaller part of that. So we are trying to be more effective in our engagement, not just in terms of around individual planning, but also in terms of strategic planning, to make sure that we're trying to deliver the services that parents want. Majority of parents tell us they would just like more, and that's the challenge. But so this structure is absolutely representing the staff. In terms of we previously did look at the idea of a specialist autism unit, and we kind of moved quite the way down. And some members may recall that work was developed around that, and that intention was to bring some of our young people out of residential units to use that funding. I have to say, when the logistics of it became quite problematic, and geography in our region doesn't serve us in terms of for being able to establish a provision somewhere in the region that can then serve the whole of the communities, all communities, and effectively we would have young people on transport most of their time, moving backwards and forwards. So at the moment we're not looking at that, and we're very much more looking at the model that we've developed at Park Primary, which is actually having resource within a school that's more dedicated and focused around children on the spectrum, and actually trying to build capacity there and trying to build that model in other parts of the region, which comes back to this pathway planning. We haven't got that everywhere. We haven't got the right kind of provision. At the moment, we're often putting young people with behavioural issues together with young people with autism issues, sometimes with other learning difficulties, and sometimes with physical difficulties. And we need to be able to be a little bit more smart in terms of being able to give some young people, because we know one can trigger the other and vice versa. So the point of this exercise is really to pursue the model, as Councillor Lever has already said, which is absolutely about inclusion. That is our model in Dumfries and Galloway. It's not just because it's the right thing to do, and it's because it's actually legislatively the expectation, this presumption of mainstreaming, but also in terms of our geography, it's very difficult to be able to establish provision that can be large enough to make the economies of scale work, that can then actually physically be available to every part of Dumfries and Galloway.
Thanks, Chair. I'm looking at the recommendations here on page 11. 2.3. Is 2.3 an admission that there are serious gaps in our provision? That's my first point.
I think it's an admission that the iterative development of provision across the region, which has often been about opportunities when space has become available, about being able to develop that, about when groups have emerged of children with particular needs that we've developed. I think we're at the point where actually the amount of need that we have, and that is actually we need to be more strategic in terms of what we've got and what we haven't got, and planning not just for now but for the future as well. So I suppose you could say a glaring omission. I would like to say that this is us identifying that actually what we've got isn't going to be able to meet the needs of Dumfries and Galloway going forwards. So we're trying to come back to members and to feed into the transformation process to make sure that we have got that provision fit for the future.
And the second point, how will you reassure parents that the primary focus of support provision will be in a mainstream context?
I think some of the possible confusion comes that we talk about special schools, because actually, according to the legislation that we work to, all of our learning centres, which we have always assumed and have said that they're part of inclusion, because we would want young people in a learning centre to be able to access the mainstream as well, they're actually special schools. But they are still part of schools. There's still pathways within that for young people. So I suppose, how would we reassure that? By continuing to pursue and to state the intention of Dumfries and Galloway Education Service, which is to deliver the presumption of mainstream. We are very bounded by the legislation in terms of what we can and what we can't do, and the legislation very clearly sets out key criteria that would allow you to say a child shouldn't be supported in their mainstream class school or in a learning centre within their mainstream school.
I think it is very important indeed that this message be conveyed to parents.
I think the importance of the learning centres is that youngsters can access those and mainstream at the same time, as and when they need the particular level of support, which is very important. Okay, Robert?
You've referred once or twice to increased pressures and demands, and it's probably out with the scope of this report, but are there reasons for that increased demand over the years?
I think, apologies, but I think we're better at identifying need and understanding need. You know, I think that 10, 15 years ago, did we talk about autism as such a wide spectrum? Are we better at understanding the individual needs and actually expecting to be able to meet individual needs? I think that these are all this is the world that we live in now, where actually that there are better diagnostic processes, that families are able to much more effectively self-identify and then request support. That would be one part, I think. I think another part is possibly that we are seeing, particularly with children coming through into school now, that some of the expectations that maybe we previously had around a child ready for learning, they're not there. Some of the parenting isn't necessarily as what we would want for young people to be ready to learn. So I think that some time we are finding that we're taking on some of those key responsibilities that in terms of toileting, in terms of behaviour, in terms of affect control, that we would previously have expected would be part and parcel of before you arrive at school.
Jim Dempster?
Thanks, Chair. So page 29, the flow chart, where it talks about route map for pupils, and I realise there's only one senior school in Upper Nithsdale, but Sanka Primary Learning Centre looks after kids with severe complex needs. And then if you look at the secondary provision, there is no provision for pupils in the secondary phase with more complex needs, with or without physical health needs. I think it's only talk about what might be made available, but no other specialist facilities, which means that children with complex needs in Sanka Primary School, they have their peers, they're in class with them. Suddenly, kids move to the academy, and these children with complex needs, the last thing they need is to be removed from a familiar environment and shipped 30 miles away to New Langlands. I think that's unacceptable, and I realise that you have identified an issue, Hugh, but I'd be encouraged or I'd be delighted to know what you propose to do to try and make sure. It is the biggest area of deprivation in the area. There are lots of kids with complex needs, with a variety of needs in senior and primary schools. I'd be keen to know what you propose to do.
I think this exercise is about absolutely being explicit about where have we got those gaps, and the next phase is really trying to is to come up with a plan and come back to members with how we intend to deal with that. At the moment, you're absolutely right. We have young people that would be moving, in fact, would be coming part of the way down the valley to Thornhill, and actually Thornhill isn't set up as to be able to deal with significant and complex either. So we are bringing a lot of secondary young people into Dumfries and into Langlands, and that's putting pressure on Langlands as well. So I don't have the answer for you right now, Councillor, but that will be the intent of coming back to you early in the new year to be able to come back with this is what we've got, this is what we haven't got, and these would be the proposals. But that will be a challenging in the resource environment that we're in to be able to come up with something. But you're right that our transport budget is significantly under pressure because we're having to move a lot of young people around significant distances, and that we need to be able to use all our resources to build business cases to be able to say, actually, is it more cost effective? Is it more carbon neutral if we can keep young people in the schools? Some of the challenges are the size of provision. There is almost a minimum amount of size that actually where you're almost not being able to offer some of the social experiences that young people would need for those young people with the most complex of needs. And I'm really talking about the most physical and complex of needs. But so I don't have the answer for you right now what we're doing, but we will be coming back.
Thanks, Hugh, and thanks, Chair. I'm delighted with that. The only other thing I would say, I hope, and I know you will do a mapping exercise and try if there's a cluster somewhere to ensure they go to the nearest school, know the most convenient school for the system, but the nearest school for these children to be able to access the services they need.
Kenny? Kenny? No? It's probably Mel. Adam?
Thanks, Chair. I think it's been quite a useful discussion. I think particularly the figure on that there's a 25% increase in the number of young people accessing additional support plans is a very important one. I notice on 3.3, which I think has been touched on slightly, that the Scottish Government are commissioning a formal review into supporting learners. I think I can probably save the Scottish Government a wee bit of money that when you try to do the same with less money, but also experience an increase in demand, that something isn't going to work. And it probably doesn't take a review for you to know that. I think as well, tied in with it, it's not actually in these papers, but I know there's been sort of announcement that the Scottish Government are going to increase or put in additional support for learning funding of about £50 million, which isn't really enough. When we look at the level of funding provided for additional support for learning in 2010, if we still had that level of funding today, there would be another £3.2 million invested in additional support for learning, which would go an awful long way in supporting our local young people. So I would hope that when we do start to see our contributions being asked for into that review, that that is one of the many points that we need to make about how actually it takes more funding, it takes more teachers, it takes more additional support for learning assistance to make sure that we can make sure that we do have the resources in place to support all of our young people. Whether that's in the classroom, whether that's in a small group, whether that's in a learning centre, or whether that is in a specialist school. And I would hope that as in that consultation, that review takes place, that is the type of thing that we are feeding back into that review.
Okay, so can we move to the recommendations? Can we note 2.1, 2.2, agree 2.3, agree 2.4, agree 2.5, sorry, note 2.5, note 2.6, and a further recommendation at 2.7 about a further report to come to the committee in the new year. Okay, thanks, Ian. Okay, members, if we move to agenda item 4 on page 41, the ICT update. As you recall, members requested a committee on the 5th of September that an update on ICT in school be provided to this committee, in particular in relation to the Windows 10 rollout over the summer holiday period and the subsequent issues and resolutions. This report provides members with a summary of the issues experienced and the lessons learned in relation to this upgrade programme. The report also highlights other key areas of development in ICT across our schools, i.e. hub and spokes, print strategy in schools, management, information system. And we have Susan Martin to speak to the report. Is there anything you want to add at this point?
If I could, please, Chair, if I could just add that since writing the report, a lot of the information in it was based on the statistics that are available from calls logged from staff. However, I've been out in schools quite a bit in the last fortnight or so as part of transformation events and been talking directly with staff, and that has transpired not to be the case. There are many staff still reporting issues, but they're not actually, well, they're telling me about issues, they're not reporting them. So what I've done this week is actually ask our school technical team to, in every school, meet with the principal teacher so that every single department can log anything that is outstanding so that we can action them in every school because they're not coming through on the normal mechanisms through the help desk. So we're unaware of them really, which means that we can address that.
Thanks, Susan. Members? Adam?
Thanks for that. You've maybe preempted my question ever so slightly, because I noticed on page 49 in the update that you provided in September that one of the things is limited printing facilities. And I think I've heard quite a few teachers talk about actually printing off some resources at home to make sure that they've got them for the next day. And again, you know, a number of representations have been made about some software that isn't available within the schools that teachers would have used had it been in place. So I think my main question is that we're now in November and rapidly approaching the halfway point in the academic year. At what point are we going to see these issues resolved? You know, I would kind of hope that would be relatively soon.
I believe that all the printing issues should be resolved. There shouldn't be outstanding printing issues, and I also alluded in the paper to our print strategy and how we plan to develop that in order that, in actual fact, the schools who had moved to our print strategy had many, many less issues with the move to Windows 10 because they were already set up to network printers. That wasn't so many standalone printers. The schools who had standalone printers, we needed drivers and things updated to make them all work. So that was part of the problem. So we plan to accelerate the move to the print strategy in every secondary school, which would mean that that's not an issue moving forward. So as far as I'm concerned and aware, but I might get something back through the technical meetings that are happening just now, the print problems are resolved. So that's that part of it. The second part of it would be the software. So again, all software that is compatible with Windows 10 and has a license has been put back on the system. There are some outstanding pieces of software that either are not compatible or schools couldn't provide us with licensing details, and therefore we couldn't put it back onto our school network until we got that updated. The exception to that is the one that was in the update that I gave you on the 5th of September around LAN School. So LAN School is a piece of software that allows the class teacher to manage the devices in the room. So for example, you could put whatever on your screen onto all the pupil devices, or you can blank their devices so that they have to watch what you're doing and they can't be working away at the same time. We had been, as I said, on the 5th of September, we were exploring a couple of free pieces of software that we believed might be a solution to replace LAN School, which is no longer available. They have proved not to be acceptable. So we have only just signed off on a procurement contract last week to get a replacement for Land School. So it's taken longer, but I didn't want to put something in that wasn't going to do the job it needed to do, on top of all the issues we had. So again, the software should be working its way through and should be resolved.
So just in terms of that Land School, I can remember being on the receiving end of having a blank screen. Do we know when that procurement process will be completed and have a timescale for a bit of software actually being put in?
So the procurement's done. We're now ready to place the order, and we're hoping to have that in schools, hopefully by the end of November, but certainly before the Christmas holiday, so that when we come back in January, because it's new software, so the other aspect to that is that we're going to have to make sure that we get some help out to teaching staff so that they can use that new software in the way that will help them. So we need to do that piece of work. We aim to have that out to them ready for starting term in January at the very latest, but I'm aiming for as soon as possible.
Kenny?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just noting on paragraph 3.2 that it says halfway through, however, it should be noted that Windows 10 has been successfully rolled out across the council network. And that's all very well and good. I'm not too sure why that sentence is in there, but what it actually says to me, it stresses the difference between the corporate network and the education network, in that the support team there is able to roll out a major upgrade in a certain system, but in a kind of subsystem of that, or the education system beside that, it's a struggle. Is there an acknowledgement within the ICT team and BTS that the education network is very different and has very different requirements at all?
Yes, indeed there is. And actually, if you go into the second sentence of that paragraph, Kenny, where we actually did the testing in the bridge, that was specifically because the bridge is set up on the curricular network, not the council network. And I wasn't content to say that council network works, therefore the schools network will. That's why we did the testing at the bridge. We're very aware that it's very different, and it needs to be different. That's to the benefit of our learners. So it needs to be different. But I think what this has done is it's highlighted, again, if I go back to some of the lessons learned, it's highlighted the additional level of checks and balances that need to be in place prior to a rollout.
Thank you for that. I acknowledge that what you said earlier about you're going to have an increased presence in schools, because back in a previous life as a software engineer, that was industry best practice of you go into your customer site and you understand what their requirements are. Also, obviously, your communication paragraph as well, 3.8, I acknowledge that, and I acknowledge the discussion groups that are going to start. There's still an issue around there, though, in terms of communication. You know, a few weeks ago we came back, I think it might have been after the holidays, there's a new firewall in place. Teachers have got lessons planned. They suddenly can't get access to websites that they could previously. We've got situations where kids, you know, S6s applying to university can't get onto their Gmail account to do their UCAS application, but they can access social media. So, you know, those extra checks and making sure that there's a standard suite of, you know, access to various internet sites, that surely has to happen more often, because these changes, we're not told about them. You come in on a Monday morning and your lesson, and we had lessons that were all to pot because of the new firewall system. So, you know, that process has to mature a little bit, does it not, in terms of making sure that we get it right for our staff and our kids?
I absolutely agree with you, and I think that was, for me, probably the most disappointing thing in the world when we came back after the holidays. However, that's exactly why I'm planning to set up the user groups, because actually what we need is we need the people on the ground to be very explicit about what you need for learning and teaching, so that that can be built into, and I envisage coming out of that a bit of a testing fact sheet that is a tick sheet that all of these things have been checked and tested prior to us saying that that's ready to go. So that user group will absolutely inform that, and that's why I want that group to be practitioners, because actually with the greatest of respect, I don't need a head teacher telling me that. I want the people who are delivering the lessons to be telling us what their needs are, so that we can make them better.
Thank you.
Tracy?
Thank you, Chair. What I'd like to know, Susan, is how are we with the access to Wi-Fi? And I was part of an event this time last year, and I stood there and promised students that they would have access to Wi-Fi all over all the secondary schools, and I'm not sure that that's actually in place.
Sorry, that's right. It's not actually. It's ready to go, but because of the problems with Windows 10, the pilot was scheduled to start in St Joseph's and Dalbeattie immediately after the summer, once Windows 10 was rolled out. However, because of the problems we've had, obviously I don't want to compound that with something else. But we are now ready to test that software, and that will be quite a short pilot of software test of Wi-Fi testing and the bring your own device testing in those schools. Be quite a short period, because we believe actually that I'm confident that will be quite straightforward. We have seen it tested. I have seen it myself tested. So we just need to make sure that it's meeting schools' needs, which is the purpose of the live test. And as soon as that is done, it's ready to switch on in all the other schools. So that will come fairly quickly on the back of that test at St Joseph's and Dalbeattie, unless it throws us up something that we're not aware of at the moment.
Sorry to push you, Susan, and just ask you to promise too much. Do you know roughly when everything's off out with the pilot, how long straight after that will all the other schools, because the young people are using their own data at the moment, so it would be really good, especially coming up to exam times, a lot of research needing done and such like.
I'm not in a position to give you a date. However, we are really keen to get this rolled out. I think that the key for me, and the reason I'm not prepared to give you a date, is that I need to understand the implication it has on the bandwidth in the school, and just be absolutely certain that youngsters using devices is not going to in any way be detrimental to youngsters on the school network. And I just need to see that in practice on that scale to be assured that that's okay. I am assured it is then a switch of a button to switch that on everywhere else, and we will be starting the work with the secondary schools to make sure they've got the policies in place about how you would engage with bring your own device and what that will mean for students and for staff and for classroom management, etc., so that they are ready when we switch the button, that they can make use of it.
Willie?
Yes, Chair. Could I just ask, I'm looking at 3.5, Susan, and I'm looking at, we recognise the frustration, and I think some of that frustration sort of spilled out at the breakout session that we were in Stranraer Academy when they did the transformation evening. What I would like to ask is, what will be the impact on the pupils be because that was coming out from that discussion? And will there be any consequences on the kids, on the pupils? Because we didn't go into the system, the IT system fully operating and so forth.
I think it's the role of all of our staff, and as you know, and from those conversations the other night, our staff are working especially hard, both our teaching staff in the classrooms, to make sure that impact on pupils is absolutely minimised and that they're getting the opportunities at other times to catch up on anything that they maybe couldn't do during the issues, the sort of period. But also and I think what Kenny touched on as well, you know, the work of our technician staff to absolutely, they are absolutely prioritising particularly senior phase subject areas where they will need that ICT to be able to undertake exams fairly soon. We'll have a round of prelims coming up in the not too distant future. So it's about making sure that everything is working as it should for those prelims, but actually that those young people have got access to IT at other times if there is any catch-up required.
Is that an assurance that there will be no impact, or you know, minimising doesn't say that there will be no impact, or indeed there will be no consequences?
I would have thought, Chair, it's impossible to measure that. But what we're trying to do is absolutely minimise it, that things happen every single day to our 20,000 young people, and it's not possible to measure retrospectively what impact that might have. What our job to do as officers, and I know that you support this, is to ensure that we absolutely prioritise to try and make sure a minimal impact takes place. But it would be disingenuous to be able to say that we could measure whether there was no impact or any impact.
John?
Yeah, thanks again, Chair. I was concerned at 3.9.3 to read that about 60 of our primary schools are still not fully utilising fibre connections. And I was wondering if there was a timetable to have these primaries upgraded. And furthermore, I wondered if that's internal to the council cost or will that be carried out externally?
Okay, so as you will be aware through reporting back to this committee, we undertook a programme of Wi-Fi upgrade for our secondary sector with a view to the whole bring your own device and supporting learning across the secondary sector. That funding was secondary specific. We're currently working up a bid in terms of where, again, it's the same as we've talked about earlier, where are the gaps, which of our schools need not only an upgrade in bandwidth, or in broadband bandwidth, which is the easy bit, if you like, because that's just the money. Not that that's easy, but that's the money. Where compared to those schools who need roads dug up and they don't even have access to fibre yet. So we're trying to pull together that mapping of exactly what that is and exactly what those costs will be, and put a bid to capital funding to see if we can get those prioritised, so that we've then got a schedule for the primary schools that will follow that rollout of improved broadband and Wi-Fi in the primary sector.
So there's no funding available through SOCEP or BT Openreach. It all has to be found internally.
Sorry, almost all. So there is a project through SOCEP at the moment through that Rural Gigabit Connectivity Programme, and we're going to be able to upgrade 19 of our schools through that, but that will still leave us with that gap of that further 41, and that will be internal funding, unless we continue to watch and monitor and see what else might become available that we can obviously bid for to help us with those costs.
Ian?
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of small points. I'm very grateful for this item being raised at the last committee and it coming forward. But in regards to the recommendations and the decisions what look to take, just because of the discussion that's been had in particular, I wonder if we should get a final update, reassurance, whether it's next March or whenever this actually comes to a conclusion. I do think we need the reassurance in the final update in regards to all the concerns and issues that are still being raised are actually bottomed out. So we don't see that contained, so maybe it's appropriate you raise that, Chair.
I don't see any problem with that. Yep, do that. Okay. Okay, members, moving to the recommendations, can we note 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, 2.6, and agree a further recommendation that further report comes to committee about March time? Yeah, okay. So if we move on to item 5 on page 51, school transport policy. This report asks members to consider the updated school transport policy for 2019. This policy was last agreed by members of the Education Committee in September 2015. It's important to keep this policy under regular review to ensure parents and schools have current information and contact details. As there have been recent questions from parents and members over the roles and responsibilities for curricular transport and transport for children with additional support needs, this policy has been reviewed and is brought for members' consideration. We have Gillian to speak to this. Gillian, is there anything going on?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members. There are no significant changes to the transport policy. It's been 4 years since its last agreement. And since that time, the team have moved from Woodbank to Irish Street, so there's a change in contact details. We've also identified some areas of question. Parents have been asking questions about curricular transport, so we've tried to set out the roles and responsibilities for curricular transport and a little bit more detail with regards to additional support for learning and what a parent should do if they feel that a child's transport needs are not being met, particularly if there are small numbers of peers in the school that they are currently in. So I'm happy to take any questions, but I'd like to reassure members this is very similar to the transport policy we have been working with since 1994.
Members? Willie?
Yeah, Chair, I've looked through the document and pleased to hear, well, maybe no pleased to hear, but on what Gillian says, that it's just about the same in terms of operational and practice. But I'm looking at 3.2, and I know it is the practice that we do look at this in terms of where it says required based on particular assessed additional support needs, or where a family is facing financial hardship. And I think that there is a need in terms of the Council's anti-poverty strategy to look at this in more detail so that people who are facing hardship, that we do write it into the policy that we will consider some form of support and assistance in getting their children to school. It is not in here, and while it may be the practice, I think it would be right and proper under the anti-poverty strategy to build that into the policy.
Director?
Chair, yeah, happy to take that one. Yeah, we've certainly looked at that before. Members have made agreement before to provide some resource. The sort of challenge has always been around ensuring there was still consistency around the whole project and around the entitlement agenda. And therefore, if members might recall, the agreement previously in setting aside some policy development funding was very, very specific, and it tended to be around set criteria such as parents or families who might be on free meal entitlement who lived just slightly outside, or maybe between 2 and 3 miles instead of beyond 3 miles, for example. So I think in a sense, trying to be compassionate and recognise that for some people they might be just outside a boundary and it might be quite difficult for them to pay for buses. Set criteria were set out and some funding was set aside for that, and that continues to be the case. If members are minded to go further than that, that really requires some significant policy development funding and perhaps would form part of any budget considerations. But we do have at least some provision in there at present.
Yeah, Chair, I think I did say that I recognise that, and in practice it does happen when there are cases that come to members' attention. But I think in terms of the Council's anti-poverty strategy, it would be wrong not to have that built in and look at what development funding that is required. I would like to see it built into the policy so that it's not a discretionary thing, and there are means of doing it. In terms of free school meals, uniforms, so forth. There is criteria there that can be applied, and I would like to see it built in, and quite happy to move that.
I think that would be quite an open-ended commitment, and there's no funds available for that at the moment in terms of just a broad sweeping commitment to doing that. Adam, you want to come in?
Maybe make a helpful suggestion that the member officer working group on the new tackling poverty strategy might be the place to bring that up.
And Chair, I could also add that it is on the agenda for that group to consider. I think we do recognise that a big challenge and barrier for young people in terms of poverty is the transport and communication question. And so whilst it may or may not be built into this policy, I do think the member officer working group have got the transport issue on their agenda to look at, councillors. Okay.
Chair, it's with regard to 5.2 on the curricular travel. It says where a school roll has fallen. Is that not sort of open-ended, whereby if it's 300 kids and it drops to 299, you could possibly argue that there might be a peer issue if someone's wanting travel from, instead of going to their local school, to one that suits them better, etc. And the other point, the responsibilities in the Appendix 2, providing service to contracts of drivers and escorts, are all our drivers who maybe in taxis, etc., or bus drivers, are they all PVG registered?
Thank you. Yes, I'll take the second question first. Yes, absolutely. All drivers and escorts should be PVG registered. That's part of the procurement exercise, so they absolutely should be. It's regulated work in terms of working with children, providing a service to children and being in contact with children over a period of time that they could build a relationship. So they should be, and if there's any issues with that, we would pick that up with the providers. In terms of the section 5.2, this is a really difficult one to manage. I'm being quite honest here, because what we're aware of is that a number of parents are concerned that particularly in very small schools, and I take your point, if a school roll falls from 800 to 700, we're really not talking about the same situation. But we've got some very small schools where there may only be one child in primary 2 through 3, 4, for example. The parent may wish their child to attend another school because there are no peers to learn with, but they are not entitled to transport because that is still their catchment school. And we're often in a bit of a catch-22 situation, because we cannot close the school without parental agreement or request, but nor can we offer transport if that school still exists. So we have worked with some parents to look at some short-term provision for a test of change, to see whether or not provision of transport might better meet the child's needs and support the parent's request to school in a different area.
Rob?
Thank you, Chairman. If you'll indulge my curiosity, the Director made a point about consistency, and I noted at 3.1 the special arrangements that we have for secondary schools in Dumfries Borough, which I have to admit, even though I've been on the committee for some time and been quite heavily involved in Dumfries Learning Town over the years, was something that had entirely passed me by. I wonder, therefore, whether it's something that is now much used, and if there is any information on that. Clearly the criteria would suggest, given that the pupils would need to be eligible for assistance with transport already, that the numbers might be a bit low. But it does strike me as being an anomaly, so I just wondered if we had any indication of the extent to which it's used now, if at all. And I guess also whether it's something that needs to be looked at more in the context of Dumfries Learning Town and the fact that we would anticipate pupils from secondary schools will travel between many of them, or in some cases all of them, in any given week, certainly for the senior phase. So, idle curiosity, Chairman, if you'll indulge me.
Thank you. It is used. I can certainly get numbers for you. If it is used for all pupils who live more than 3 miles out of the borough boundary, so it would be pupils from Shaw Head or along the New Abbey Road or up towards Thornhill, and they're coming into Dumfries, but they are choosing a different school to their catchment. So we incur the cost of them coming into Dumfries, and then they can make their onward journey to their chosen secondary school. So as long as it doesn't cost us any more to transport them for example, beyond Cargan Bridge, Shaw Head, into the Dumfries Borough, whether they are entitled to go to North West or the high school, as long as they're responsible to get themselves to the high school or the academy, it doesn't cost us any more. It's a historical agreement, and it was members that took the decision in 1994 to do so.
Grateful for the clarification. That makes sense now.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just being a bit picky. On page 60, pupils who live 2 miles away, could you add a 2 or more miles away so the pupils aren't living in a knife edge? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I suppose, Gillian, my question is in regards to the right to the request a review. I'm just wondering, could you outline what the process in regards to that? Recently had a case, I think you're aware of that, and it was very much on the margins. So I think the software package that the council undertakes, it showed it's something like 2.89 miles. Actually went out on the bike and physically did it with a Garmin at just over 3 miles. So just when it's as close as in this request, it's no statutory, but obviously we'll undertake that. But I'm not exactly sure what considerations an officer might be looking at when it comes to actually this request.
Thank you. I'm not an expert on the GIS mapping system, but I believe it doesn't take into account the ups and downs of the hills as well as it could. And we know it's got a variance of about 0.005, as I understand from the computing people. So in absolute fairness, that if a parent believes that they are 3 miles from the school and their families have had transport for many years on that basis, and our Find My Nearest system measures them at 2.85, then they have a right to review, and we measure in 3 different ways, and we take the lowest. And the final, so it could be a mapping tool, it could be the GIS modelling tool, or it could be it's going to be gender non-specific, a guy with a wheel. It could be somebody with a wheel who actually manually measures it, so that we're absolutely clear that that the distance is as accurate, and we give the benefit of the doubt to the parent if the 3 measures do not come up the same.
Okay, if we move to the...
Thank you, Chair. Just a point of clarification. 6.3 on page 57 with regard to seat belts. Regulations require all rear passengers in a bus or coach to wear seat belts. What technically is a rear passenger in a bus or coach?
Anybody behind the driver?
In other words, all passengers. Thank you.
Right. Members, moving to the recommendations, can...
Just on that last point, because the kids know, or the drivers know that they are transporting children under 12, do they all have to carry booster seats? Because that is a legal requirement if they're under a certain height and a certain age. I think over 12 they don't require it, but under 12 they do require a booster seat if they're under, is it 1 metre 35?
Thank you. I know we do in taxi provision, but I don't know about buses. So can I come back to you on that? Thank you.
Right, can we move to the recommendations? Can we agree the school transport policy? Okay. So moving to item 6 on page 65, the update to the school admission policy and procedure. The current school admission policy was approved by SIPL committee in November 2017. The purpose of the school admission policy and procedure is to offer clarity for parents with regards to policy and procedures with enrolments and requests for place at local primary and secondary schools from parents' prospective pupils. Parents may opt for a place in any school they wish at any time, but priority for a place will be granted to children from the recognised catchment area and those agreed by a resourced provision allocation panel. Members are asked to reaffirm their agreement of this policy in advance of the forthcoming round of enrolments to our school. May I have Gillian to speak to it again? Anything you want to add, Gillian?
No, nothing to add. Members will be aware that this is a policy we bring regularly as we move to enrolling pupils into primary and secondary school at this time of the year. There are no substantive changes, and we're asking members to note the panel approach to resource provision for children with additional support needs. We've brought both of these now together.
Could I just ask how this new policy is working? I've sat on the panel a few times, and it's really quite difficult on occasion, and some of these are justified. And I presume not maintaining the catchment place is to make the people think really long and hard about applying. But in your experience, is that putting off the occasional legitimate case, because it's quite a thought to lose your place at your own school, while you might think there's a real need or justification for your child to go to alternative school? Has that, in your opinion, put off people who may have a legitimate case to move their child to another school?
I'm not sure about put off, but I think you're right in that it has perhaps sharpened the mind of people making an application, almost a speculative application. We were in a difficult situation having to plan for the unknown, with having to hold catchment places until after March, and that was making it difficult for other families who were waiting for decisions for the first families. So we took the decision to remove the catchment place, as is our right, if they were making an application for an additional school. There certainly has been a reduction in the number of requests. Whether it's due to that case, George, I'm not sure.
Just follow that up just quickly. If a parent is undecided and they have got real concerns and they think it would be an option, I'm presuming there'll be good guidance for these people. You can't obviously say before an appeal that it's because they're going to be successful or not, but are you making them fully aware of the potential consequences and give them an idea? I know this is really difficult to say, yeah, well, put an appeal in sort of thing, which, you know, it's that kind of guidance that parents might have who feel they have a legitimate case, but they don't want to risk So it may merely just pull back, or we'll just live with it.
I'm always happy to talk to parents about the pros and cons of this. I think on paper it's quite a stark process, but it's a good conversation to have. Firstly, why are you looking to move out with catchment? Is there anything we can do to assure you about your provision in your catchment school? And if a parent is undecided or is unhappy, we publish all of the capacities, we publish the number of appeals we've had and whether they've been successful or not, so they can get a sense of trends. And I'm always happy to speak to parents if they have particular questions.
Okay, members, can we move to the recommendation? Can we agree 2.1, the updated school admission? Note 2.2, and I'm sure we're now reminded of the appeal process of placing requests. Thanks, Julian. Okay, so if we move to item 7. On page 85, the Dumfries Learning Town update. This report lets members know that there have been positive discussions with all 5 school heads and parent council chairs about a pragmatic way forward to complete the Dumfries Learning Town programme. For each school, a short summary of current conditions and initial proposed plans is provided. And we have Paul McCulloch and Lauren Foss here to answer any questions. Is there anything you want to add to your report at this stage? No. Okay.
Thanks, Chair. Nothing to add to it, Chair.
Okay, members? George?
This is just general feedback. I'm speaking on behalf of Mel in her capacity as chairman of the Dumfries and Galway Parents Forum, and it touches on the transformational process as well. But feedback from quite a lot of parents is that they're concerned about, for example, budget cuts on assisted support learning, subject choices, even teachers' numbers. So they're just asking the question, weighing up budget costs on a 4th upgrade in Dumfries against that finance going into teacher provision, ASL and things like that. It's a very general thing. I know it's tied up in other transformational stuff, but the feeling that we're getting from parents is that their preference would be to maintain assisted support learning, teacher numbers, etc., rather than millions of pounds going into refurbishment and new build, that sort of thing. And I know that's a very complex area, but that's the feedback we're getting from parents.
Paul?
Yeah, just to be clear, in terms of the proposals to refurbish or renew, that will come from capital allocations rather than revenue. But your point's well made. What we need to do as part of this new model is ensure that we don't just capture the capital costs of any new build or refurbishment, but that as part of the business case process and the budget setting process, that we capture those revenue costs as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pleased to see progress. I've got a slight concern that a number of parents, particularly from Dumfries, are only finding out about these developments sort of whenever, these papers come to this committee and they're therefore reported in the press, parents at Lorburn, at Noble Hill. And, I'm slightly concerned that, actually we're trying to do something really good here, but we're actually turning people against us because they actually don't know what's going on. And certainly, last time we sort of ruled out the sort of central campus idea. This time actually we need to do a wee bit of further work at Lorburn Primary School, and it looks like to me that actually, because of things happening in and around Lorburn, because of the information that we've got here, that actually the central campus idea might actually be a viable solution, and more cost effective than just simply refurbishing each of the 2 schools. So I think that we really need to focus on that engagement with the wider parent body who, for the majority of them, are finding out what's happening by press reports and reports to this committee. And I think that isn't really in the, we want to maintain momentum. We want, this is a really good thing that we're doing. We don't want to jeopardise that by not communicating with parents much more widely.
Okay, yeah, so in terms of that engagement, the initial contact was with the head teacher and the chair of the parent teacher council. So the intention as we go forward is to involve the parents in this process. There will be consultations to be undertaken as part of this, so we'll certainly take that on board.
And I understand. Where are we with regard to the condition surveys? Are they being conducted now? And the £500,000 investment in Lorry now, have we placed the contract for that?
So in answer to your first question, yes, the condition surveys are now underway, and we've advised schools that the surveyors will be coming in imminently to undertake that work. The intention is that the information contained within the condition surveys and the costs associated with the upgrades will be reported back to members in January. You know, and that's where we are. With regards to Lorry now, things are progressing on programme. So that contract is about to be awarded, and that work will commence pretty soon.
In that case, can we move to the recommendations? Can we note 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4? Can we agree 2.5, 2.6, 2.7? And 2.8. Okay, thank you, members. So moving on to item 8 on page 91, the request to review school capacity stroke catchment in Wallace Hall Academy and Gretna Primary School. This report merges two requests received by community councils and discussed with officers. Following some initial scoping prior to bringing the papers here today, members are asked to consider if officers should progress work on school catchment for Wallace Hall Academy and school capacity in Gretna Primary School. And Gillian, you're working hard today. You're speaking to this. Is there anything you want to add at this point?
So I know that members were expecting this originally to come to Area Committee in the first instance, but we were advised by governance that since there may be financial budget consequences, that it would be appropriate to bring it to Service Committee first, have the agreement for officers to bring back recommendations, and then to take those recommendations back to Area Committee. So I'm sorry it's been a few more months. We're certainly a couple of months later than I had initially envisaged, but I have written to the community councils to inform them that it's coming to the committee today.
No? Oh, Karen.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Gillian, for this report. And yeah, we did ask for it, but understand just what you've explained there. I do appreciate the fact that we're getting the opportunity to discuss this. The reason that we actually asked for it to come, well, members met with Gillian and the Community Council members. The reason that we asked it to come to Area Committee was so as that members of Andale and Eskdale with the local knowledge could discuss where best this actually sits, because it isn't just, I don't see it just as a pressure on the education. I think it's a pressure across directorates within the council, and I think we need to look at it like that as joint up working. It's the amount of identified units to be built out in the local development plan that is actually putting the pressure onto the education department. So I think we need to look at all sitting around the table to discuss the fact of, you know, the current units that are being built out are by registered social landlords. They don't give any developer's contribution. So, you know, we need to look at the fact that if we're not getting any developer's contribution, then where is the money going to come for looking at the capacity issue, which the projected capacity issue for this year was 250. But I think I'm right in saying that the school roll is 287. So there's quite a discrepancy there already, so there is. And that's only after 50 houses being allocated, a further 60 plus being built out at the moment, with another few hundred looking to be built out. And I understand there was 500,000 from one of the committees, the finance procurement was given towards upgrading the Scottish water and sewage. So there is going to be capacity for them units to be built out, which we welcome, but we need to make sure that we're actually equipped for that. The other thing is, I mean, we have to look at the actual condition of the school currently. We are aware that it's bursting at the seams, the layout of the school, there's windows that's not opening, there's problems with the toilets, so it is a bigger problem, and I think that we need to be looking at, for the early childcare, 1140 hours going to be introduced. I think we need to be looking at main key stakeholders round the table, and that's including your private PVI sectors, if you like, just to see how we can all work in a joint up, team. if like. Just one of the things that I would like to ask, if possible, what consultation's been done with the head teacher and the teachers at the school?
Absolutely none, because at this point, but I spoke to John this morning, John, the head teacher at Gretna Primary, and I hadn't spoken with John regarding this particular paper, predominantly because until we had a decision about moving forward with options, I didn't want to scare the horses, and we didn't want to set any hares running until we had some permission to do so. I'm very, very keen to meet with John now. I think we're all grateful to the Community Council for putting this on the agenda timiously. We have till 2029, I think, until all the units are built out. Now, we're clearly not going to take that long, but we have got some time. But we do know that there are pressures on the places, and that we do know that the increasing numbers for early learning and childcare will require an expansion. We have other partners in the area, and as you mentioned, this is a joint piece of work so that we can do some future proofing. So following the decision today to move ahead and formally consider options for Gretna Primary School response to this, and meet the head teacher over the coming weeks.
Thanks for that. Just a quick, it says in 3.3.3 that the school rule for 2018-19, I was still in 2018-19, but you know, the school rules there don't align with sort of what Karen said, was it 270 or something that Karen said, so we can get that clarified. Just because what I'm looking at here now, I appreciate that this doesn't include sort of any new units that might be built, but it actually looks like, you know, within 5 years, there'll actually be, you know, sort of 10 less pupils at Gretna Primary School, so it'll be useful to get some clarification there. The reason why I ask is that, you know, just up the road, you know, in the Lockerbie catchment, there's been planning permission for 50 houses, and Lochmaben has been planning permission for 50 houses. Another sort of potential application, or, you know, about 100 houses in Lockerbie. You know, there's schools there that are at capacity too, with, you know, particularly in Lochmaben Primary, where one of the general purpose classrooms has just been removed, which was our last general purpose classroom. So when do we then actually consider there's actually a few schools in the region that are in a similar position to Gretna, and that actually, realistically, we should be looking at them all and seeing what we could do, because, you know, I get the same concerns from parents and teachers in my ward as well.
And I also know that a quarter of our schools are less than half full. So we know the demographics are changing. We know that where the children are and where they're choosing to learn is changing, and that's the focus of the transformation work over the coming months, to really look at are our schools fit for the size of our local communities. But I think if we made a start with looking at Gretna, and that will then widen over the Annandale and Estey.
That, Chair, that's absolutely fine, but we're looking at schools that are on the other end of the scale and are bursting at the seams, and we can't just say that, you know, we've got a problem elsewhere. And, you know, I think that if we're going to start looking at sort of the capacity in Gretna, we should also be looking at the capacity in the other schools that are in the same situation, because actually it might be a similar solution. I think that Gretna and Lochmaben, for example, were built around the same time. They certainly have the same design. You know, there might be similar solutions there.
Thank you. Just referring to Adam's point there, yeah, the projected was 250, but actually states further on in the paper that the school roll is 287. So that's where it is. So there is a discrepancy there of 37 for the projected to the actual number at this moment in time. I think we have got a major problem. I'm not just making a bit of song and dance about this. There's 723 units that are allocated to be built out in Gretna. They are actually currently being built out at quite a speed, so they are. So it is, I hear what Adam's saying, and I take that on board, but this is, you know, a current major problem.
Julie?
Yeah, as I say, we were working on projections of 250. We know we're nearly 40 out. We've got the census will be published next week with regards to this year's numbers formally. So yes, I agree, we have to work at pace and bring forward recommendations to members.
Chair, it's on the Wallace Hall request. What's the implications of that? Do we then have a knock-on effect to other schools who will then want their catchment changed because, well, we've lost that wee bit, so we need to gain more? Is it just a specific request, or will we have to look at the whole of the Wallace Hall catchment, because there might be some who just lie north of the boundary heading towards Sanker might want to come into Wallace Hall. We might have some that would want to come from other areas, AA maybe or something like that. What is the implications of opening what could be Pandora's box?
June?
I think that's exactly what the consultation should bring out. It was brought to me as a relatively simple anomaly on a map, which the community of Burnfoot has traditionally always gone to Wallace Hall, but they're not entitled to transport. It's a small group of houses and the parents take parental responsibility to transport those pupils, and there was a view that the community council boundary didn't align with the school boundary, and could I bring that into alignment? But a statutory process would then bring up whether there are other communities. So until we know what everybody else in the Wallace Hall catchment says about this, we won't really know whether it's a Pandora's box or not. So if we have permission to move forward, we'll then be able to flush that out.
Ian?
Thanks, Chairman. Just a couple of points. I noticed that paragraph 2.3, Julian, maybe when I'm saying a few things, it refers to paragraph 3.6, so maybe we could tie that one down. I don't see it within the report, so you'll get a chance to get a look at that. But I think it's been touched on it previously, but I think it's absolutely appropriate. But this covers all directorates, whether it's communities, whether it's finance, procurement, transformation, whether it's the area committee and education and learning, obviously. So I think the right thing to do would have been, and was under process, but governance obviously advised otherwise, would have been to put it to area committee. I noticed that within the report there's reference to Nestdale area committee, but not Annandale and Nestdale. I wonder if we need to actually bottom that out when it comes to making the decision. I think it's very important that there's a discussion at area committee, then the points like what Adam's bringing up can be brought up there, and that'll be incorporated in any future reports coming back to this committee in particular. I would imagine a wider community discussion at area level, whether it's Nestdale or Annandale and Nestdale, I'll feed into this committee, then it'll go to the wider committees and potentially even full council after that. So I just appreciate the clarification on paragraph 2.3 and the reassurances that when we come to make a decision, this does go back to area committee as a kind of first reference point, and from there maybe they can have their say and make their come to their conclusions. Okay.
Yes, apologies, I hadn't spotted that. These were two separate papers, and as we merged the two papers together, the reference to Annandale Nest Area Committee must have been missed. So, of course, this would come back to that area committee.
I noticed that 2.3 there's not actually paragraph 3.6 contained in there, so maybe that needs to be, maybe when we get to recommendations you'll cover that.
These are just two general points. The first is, and I think the ambition, all schools should have the same standards. All schools should have the same standards, so there shouldn't be any. If you're in a catchment area, that school should be as good as any other school, and I think that's what should be the ambition, to get these high standards. The second question that always intrigues me, I know Colin in the past has mentioned this, is the size of school. Can a primary school or a secondary school be too big? You know, Gretna's expanding to that extent, and Union's another school that has got an awful lot of children at it, and there's other schools in the area. Is there any evidence to suggest that a primary school can be too big to be run efficiently and comfortably for the kids and the teachers?
Certainly not in the scale that we're working with in Dumfries and Galloway. There are schools of over 1,000 across Scotland with primary and early learning and childcare, so we are very small comparatively.
James.
Thanks, Chair. This school's obviously in my ward. Sorry I missed the start of this agenda item. I had a meeting elsewhere. But I thought, like Gillian, it was a simple exercise to address an anomaly, and I'm surprised it's got to this stage. And I'm certainly happy to support the request, but I would have thought it'd been a relatively modest business, because this is now going to turn into a serious agenda, because you maybe have to do the same review with every school who will want catchments looked at, and you will find yourself in a difficult situation, and it might be simply something as simple as financial circumstances that are forcing these requests. But happy to support this one, and I'm surprised it's going to where it's going, but we will see what the outcome is. Certainly nobody for Sanker wanting to go down, I wouldn't have thought either. I think they're all happy where they are.
Yeah, I think it's the legislation which forces the degree of the review, rather than just making these things simple. Okay. Okay, can we move to the recommendations? Can we agree 2.1, agree 2.2, agree 2.3 with the correction about the area committee. And, sorry?
I think the paragraph could,
Yes.
would be amended. 3.6 doesn't exist, so it's referred to it. I don't sure it's 3.3.6, but that could be adjusted, obviously.
Yeah. And agree 2.4. Thank you. So moving to agenda item 9 on page 101, Education and Learning Revenue Budget Monitoring Report 2019-20 for the period ended 30th September 2019. Okay, the Revenue Budget Monitoring Report provides details of the 2019-20 budget for education and learning, and also an outturn forecast of a break-even position based on the position as at 30th September 2019. The main budget pressure relating to children require additional support through learning assistance and day placements with external providers continues. The Education and Learning Management team are currently progressing a range of measures to address the identified pressure and have indicated their balanced outturn position will be returned by the end of the year. And we have Colin Pentland and Carol Mead to speak to this paper. Is there anything you want to add at this point?
Nothing to add at this point, Chair. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking at page 105, where it gives detail where financial final outturn.
Willie, can you move the microphone closer?
Can I move it? Yeah. I'm looking at page 105, Chair, and there's a breakdown here, and it looks at the final outturn of 2018-19 for supporting learners, and that was 15,681. And then the base budget for 1920 was 14,877. My calculation on that is there was an adjustment made, or a reduction rather, of £804,000 from 1819 to 1920, when I actually thought that the reduction was about 703,000. This gives an even higher figure in that projection here. But then I go on to look at it, and it's got a projected or not coming within budget to some £401,000. Now, given that we're into 7 months or thereabouts of the financial year, just how do we expect to bring this into line with budget, in terms of that we've only got 5 months left of the financial year, and maybe even longer in terms of this anomaly that the school year is different? How will we bring that into line without causing severe suffering on the point that some of the discussion has been around this morning?
I mean, I think one issue is it's a school year as opposed to financial year, so there's a lot more than 5 months to go. We're relatively early in the school term. However, Councillor Scobie, you're quite right, it's a significant budget pressure. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And it may be we will work very hard to make sure that we are as efficient as we can be, but certainly not to the detriment of the young people's needs. And it may be we come forward and we will keep reporting on a regular basis to this committee in terms of whether that budget pressure continues and what measures need to be taken. At this early stage, on a yearly basis, we've tended to be able to either come close to resolving the matter or, if necessary, look at other efficiencies elsewhere in the service at the end of the year stage. If we can't do that this year, it might be a different report that comes to you, but that would always be what you would expect officers to do.
Was it Northern? Could I come back to you? Yeah, because I seem to remember reading the report where it was projected there would be a £93,000 shortfall on the overall 703,000, and that was at the last Education Committee. This is reflecting a 400 and odd, that we're not on target. And I come back to the point, we're 7 months into this fiscal year. Notwithstanding, I've already made the point, the anomaly that the education goes on, but that's set on a fiscal year, and to bring that into line, in my opinion, would cause serious problems and suffering to the kids who expect this service.
I think to a certain extent it's a bit like the social work budget. You know, there are unexpected pressures which you just can't identify. And given that the overall education services budget's £133,000, there is scope within that budget.
Chair, that's a significant reduction from 133 million. 133,000 for the education budget. Is that a proposal to take on? I mean, I would say there is a significant pressure here, and the reason it's at 401 is partly unexpected things that have thrown up in terms of young people's needs. It's not so much in terms of the hours that have been identified out in mainstream, but quite a lot of that pressure is around residential and the element cost of education element cost of residential care, which has gone up significantly. Social work services have brought to Social Work Committee that point about the increasing need and an unexpected demand, and that's why I'm saying to you that although we will look to manage this, it may possibly be that the report will come to Education Committee when the education element of residential challenges that we've got at the moment, so we're recognising the challenge, but we'll be doing everything we can to minimise the challenge to the Council.
You know, the transformation event at the bridge yesterday afternoon, you know, it was clear that the officers were working into bringing more of these youngsters back into the region, not only to benefit the youngsters, but also to bring the huge amounts of money which we're actually putting into their care and support back into the region. John?
Thank you, Chair. Staying on Appendix 1 on page 105, the budget adjustments to primary and secondary schools were adjusted upwardly by almost £2 million. Would that be the early effects of the teachers' pay rise showing there?
It's to do with an increase to do with the superannuation charges that was applied from the 1st of September this year, when the rate went up from about 17.4 up to about 23%. As a result, there was additional funding provided through the Scottish Government. That was to support the majority of those costs, and that's the application of that change from the last committee.
Tommy?
Thanks, Chair. It's just that it's on the recommendations on item 2.2. It's just the use of the language. Usually officers on this council are very careful about the language they use and are very quick to pick up members if they use the wrong language. They talk about the service are currently progressing a range of measures to ensure the overall spending is contained. If they can ensure it, why can't they talk to every department in this council and tell them how they can ensure? They certainly can try. How they can ensure, I don't know.
If it was helpful, we can put with the aim to ensure.
Ivor?
Thank you, Chair. It's with regard to the remaining savings require ongoing action monitoring. Now, I think I've got it right. There's about 650,000 that hasn't been achieved yet that we hope to find various things to do in year. Does that mean to say that we're looking at actually the equivalent of 1.2 million savings if it was a full year, because it's only a half year now that we have to achieve them in, so we're actually having to take double savings? And another one that's there that I didn't include was the outdoor education. It says that we've fully achieved that, yet in the narrative it says we've only achieved 73,000. What's the correct figure there, please?
Colin?
It's certainly. First thing I'll address is the outdoor education in regards to the note. The Councillor's correct. The saving to achieve today is the 146. I apologise, there was a error put in there with copying over some details were there, but you are correct, the 146 is the actual achieved today, and that has been banked. With regards to the slight difference between them, to reflect position what we're anticipating and what we've actually banked to date, we've kind of brought in the report and highlighted the column for savings achieved to date. So that's things we've physically actually in essence, bank that, like, for example, that individual for an ERVS case has actually gone and stuff like that. The next column for the forecast to be achieved is things where physically haven't been, like the ERVS case, person hasn't individually left yet, but there's a process of maybe individuals going through ERVSs just now, and the dates within reason might change, so we cannot physically say we've saved X amount of money because the date might change by a slight month. The anticipation is the plans in place for the service to achieve that saving over the course of the remainder of the year, and there is plans in place to achieve them. If that makes sense.
But most of the narratives say that they won't be achieved in year, but there are other things in being progressed. So that would suggest that because of a full year saving, we're 649,000 short. Therefore, we will find it, but where is it actually going to come from? And, are we taking it out of elsewhere at the rate of £2 instead of £1 because you're over 6 months instead of 12 months?
I suppose what we're kind of saying is we're kind of saying we do anticipate that savings to be achieved. I know it's not got a set value, but we do anticipate there'll be small shortfalls on those savings that will be offset by other mitigating measures that the management team are looking at just now. So, for example, if an ERVS case didn't start on as anticipated the 1st of December and it's moved back to the 1st of January, the service are looking at other small options to identify and address them going forward as a one-off basis until the full fruition of that saving can be achieved on a current ongoing basis due to slight timing delays within them. So within the plans we've currently got now, anticipated they will be achieved. Yes, there will be potential timing delays in the shortfall, but it's not a material amount. That, for example, that the 600,000 is going to be a shortfall. It's going to be something around potentially smaller margins, Councillor, and it's not a risk. If there was a risk that the shortfall was significant, we'd be adjusting the forecast in your savings to be short and showing it as a pressure in this one-off year. If that's okay.
Jim?
Thanks, Chair. 3.6, page 102. Is there any indication when the additional funding from the Scottish Government will actually come through?
We don't have that at present, but we anticipate it being within this school year.
Okay, members, moving to the recommendations, can we note 2.1, 2.2 with the revised wording to try to ensure, 2.3 and 2.4. Moving to agenda item 10 on page 113, Education and Learning Directorate Business Plan 2019-20 to 2022-23. At the previous meeting of the Education and Learning Committee, the business plan was considered and the main aspects agreed in principle to allow officers to work on the priorities and actions, but it was not agreed formally as the impact assessment had not yet been completed and uploaded as required. This has now been completed and hard copies of the summary sheet have been made available for members' information today, and electronic version was sent out yesterday. The report is therefore resubmitted with the local appendices, one of which has been included twice in error. Gillian Bryson will take any questions on the report. Gillian, is anything you want to add?
Members will have noted, thank you Chair, that the Appendix 2 should have been the impact assessment, but unfortunately we gave you the two appendices the same, so my apologies on compounding that error. But the impact assessment has been circulated in hard copy and the summary sheet has been uploaded to the website. So I now hope that that is in order, and apologies for the delay in bringing this back to committee.
Okay, members, given that we've already discussed this in some length, are we all happy with the impact assessment? Yeah, yes, well done. Right, okay, so can we move to the recommendations, which is to members are asked to agree the Education and Learning Business Plan for 2019-20 to 22-23, included as the Appendix 2 to this report. Okay, happy with that? Right. Well, I have no further urgent business. Colin, you wanted to say something?
Thanks, Chair. If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind just saying a couple of words. As I said in a forum yesterday, there's a great bit in Father Ted when he thinks he's leaving his parish and has had a long chance to prepare his speech. It's a quite embittered one, and he starts off with, right, I'm going to start with the liars. And then half an hour later it goes back to, and some people are sleeping, some people have left, and he says, I'm now on to the cheats. Well, I would be the exact opposite if I was doing a speech like that. It would be different type of characteristics. The good people that I've worked with at Dumfries and Galloway over the time, and in particular around the committees I've worked with, I've gone out of my way to move on quietly and keep things very low key about leaving. So this will be short and sweet, but it's just to say it has been an absolute privilege to be director over the last 12.5 years, an eighth of a century. I've probably done about 70 committees. I wouldn't go through a lot of detail, but I would reflect, I suppose, that when I started the council in the first year, we were all panicking because we had £1 million to find across the whole council. So if you compare that with the challenges today, and in fact, also at that time, my chair was sitting at that side in the opposition asking really difficult questions. So things changed quite a lot. I've worked with some really brilliant people over the time, people who I've worked for, people I've worked beside, people that have worked for me. In a really difficult, challenging world, that's what's made it really, really doable. Really good head teachers out in our schools, you know that, really good schools that we've got. So it's been brilliant. I wouldn't have worked in any other council, I wouldn't have chosen to do that. I often said to heads when we were going through challenging times, when I go to directors' meetings elsewhere in the country and I hear some other things that go on, I think Dumfries and Galloway has been a brilliant place for me to work. So it's been an absolute privilege. Wouldn't have been anywhere else. And I do think through the iterations of the Education Committee and then SIPL and then back to Education Committee, I've always worked with members that had the kids' interest at heart. And whilst we always have party politics going on, quite often that's been put aside. And I think as a council, we've tried our very best to support vulnerability in the young people. You know it's a roller coaster in politics and public service. No matter what achievements you get, you're never more than 5 minutes from disaster. But what makes it doable is the good relationships that we've got. And sometimes people will say it's a cutthroat business, but actually, when I wasn't well last year, I'll never forget the fact that how much goodwill there was towards me when I returned. So that was terrific. And that's something about Dumfries and Galloway. I move on to pastures new. I'm going to a different job, working at a national level. I'm working 3 days a week instead of 5, which is quite significant for me and my family and my grandchildren and all the rest of it. So I'm really delighted at that. But I'll be staying in CD. I won't be a stranger, hopefully. I'm still living in CD, and the stewardship is God's own country, as many members know that. So I'm quite happy to be doing so. But I just want to wish everybody all the best with the challenges ahead. I've had a fantastic time, so thanks very much. Thank you.